The sanctuary knew his rhythm before he reached the pulpit. For decades, Pastor John Hagee has been the kind of preacher people describe in absolutes, unshakable, certain, a man who speaks as if the answers are already written in stone. He built a towering platform on that voice, a congregation measured in the tens of thousands, a broadcast ministry that travels far beyond Texas, and a public identity that draws both devotion and backlash in equal measure. So when the tone shifted, even slightly, it felt like the lights dimmed without anyone touching the switch. According to the story being told, he stepped forward not with the usual thunder, but with a restraint that made the room listen harder. The hook is not a scandal shouted into the microphone. It is a moment of quiet honesty from a man whose brand has always been certainty. The video frames him as a small-town boy from Baytown, Texas, raised in a home where faith was not an accessory but a daily language, where Scripture shaped ordinary evenings and the idea of calling was treated like a real assignment. He is portrayed as disciplined in school, driven through higher education, and convinced early on that he was meant to preach. That conviction becomes the engine of his rise. In the late 1960s, he begins pastoring, and what starts small grows into something immense. Not only a church, but a campus, a system, a community that moves to his cadence. The narrative emphasizes scale because scale creates pressure. When thousands gather for you, and countless more watch from afar, you are no longer just a pastor. You become a symbol, and symbols are rarely allowed to be human. The story then widens the frame to show why he has remained divisive for so long. His blend of prophecy, politics, and public certainty has earned fierce loyalty and fierce opposition. Supporters hear courage, a leader who will not soften Scripture for modern comfort, a man who speaks with conviction when others hedge. Critics hear certainty that can harden into harm, especially when faith is used to interpret world events, to draw lines between nations, or to pass judgment on changing social values. The video leans into that tension without needing every viewer to agree with him, because agreement is not the point. The point is that the life of a man like this is lived under constant collision, applause on one side, outrage on the other, and the pressure to sound unwavering every single time he speaks. Then comes the detail that turns the spotlight inward. A marriage ending in 1975, described not as gossip, but as a collapse that carried stigma in a conservative religious world. The narrative lingers on the backlash and the whispers, the sense of credibility questioned at the very moment a pastor is expected to be flawless. It is a reminder that behind the platform, there is a human being who can bleed, and that the cost of bleeding in public is humiliation that never fully disappears. In the video's telling, he rebuilds his life, he remarries, he returns to the work, and he keeps growing the ministry, but the storm leaves a mark. It becomes part of the weight he carries into every sermon, part of the reason he has always sounded like a man determined to prove he is still standing. That is why the confession lands with force. In the service described, he does not renounce his faith. He does something more destabilizing for people who rely on him for clarity. He acknowledges that parts of God's plan are beyond human understanding. He suggests that faith is not only about answers, but about trust when answers do not come. For a preacher known for definitive declarations, that shift feels like a curtain moving. To some listeners, it is relief because it makes their own doubts less shameful and their own questions less frightening. To others, it is unsettling because certainty was the anchor they grabbed when life started to spin. And underneath that softer tone sits the real tension of this story. If a man who spent decades speaking like a final authority now admits the limits of certainty, what happens to the image that carried him and to the people who built their own confidence around it? Was it age, exhaustion, private grief, or simply the long grind of carrying other people's expectations? The video leaves that question hanging like a low, dark cloud, because once it is there, you cannot unsee it. The storm is no longer only something that happened to him. It becomes something he is finally willing to name. In the story's framing, John Hagee's public power did not come from quiet pastoral care alone. It came from a certainty of his declarations, the cadence of prophecy, the conviction that Scripture could be mapped onto headlines, and that a preacher could speak not merely to a congregation, but to a nation. That is why his influence spread beyond the walls of any sanctuary. The video describes a ministry that learned to use modern amplification, radio, television, and mass gatherings, turning sermons into a repeating signal that reached people who had never stepped onto the Cornerstone campus. And once you become a signal, you also become a target. The transcript positions him as more than a church leader. It paints him as a political figure in religious clothing, a man whose beliefs were not kept inside worship, but carried into public debates and national alliances. It highlights his strong pro-Israel advocacy through Christians United for Israel, presented as an extension of theology into geopolitical posture. For supporters, that stance reads like loyalty to Scripture and courage in a hostile world. For critics, it can look like a fusion of faith with power, where religious authority becomes leverage in political arenas. This split is essential to the video's dramatic structure. It creates an audience already divided before the confession even arrives, a loyal base conditioned to trust his certainty, and a skeptical public conditioned to suspect his motives. The transcript then escalates the tension by revisiting the controversies that have followed him for years. It references his use of biblical prophecy to interpret world events, including warnings about catastrophic conflict tied to Iran in a mid-2000s context, and it points to the backlash that followed, accusations that such messaging stoked fear and hostility rather than wisdom. It also brings up the storm around remarks interpreted as framing the Holocaust within divine purpose for Israel's founding, a subject so morally loaded that even perceived theological explanation can land as offense. The video does not linger on the nuance of those debates, because it is building a portrait, not a courtroom record. The portrait is of a man repeatedly walking into the fire, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by miscalculation, sometimes by refusing to retreat. It layers in his conservative positions on abortion and LGBTQ issues as part of an identity that invites confrontation. In the transcript's logic, these battles are not side notes. They are the forge. They harden his public persona into something almost armored, a preacher who appears to feed on resistance, who seems strongest when the room is against him. And yet, armor has a cost. You can win arguments and still lose parts of yourself. You can keep showing certainty and still feel something eroding underneath. The story begins to suggest that the true conflict was never only between Hagee and his opponents. It was between the man who must always appear unshaken and the private person who has lived long enough to know how complicated pain can be. The transcript uses a familiar but effective pivot. The public controversies are loud, but the private trials are the ones that change a person's voice. It returns to the 1975 divorce as a critical fracture point, not because divorce is rare, but because in the religious ecosystem around him it becomes a scarlet letter. The narrative emphasizes stigma, judgment, the sense that credibility can be revoked overnight. That kind of experience can produce two kinds of leaders. One withdraws. The other overcompensates, building a bigger platform, speaking louder, sounding more certain, because certainty becomes both shield and weapon. The video implies that Hagee chose the second path. He rebuilt, he remarried, he continued to grow the church, and he found in his later marriage a partnership that restored stability. But the scars remained part of the architecture. When you build an empire after being publicly questioned, the empire is never just ministry. It is proof. Proof that you survived. Proof that you were still chosen. Proof that the critics did not get the final word. The transcript also stresses the burden of leading a megachurch. Not just the logistics, but the psychological expectation that a leader must be steady at all times, must embody confidence, must speak as if doubt is a foreign language. And that is where the theme of storm becomes more than a metaphor. The video opens with a testimony of crisis, a savage storm, something he debated for months before sharing. Whether the specific event is illness, grief, fear, or spiritual exhaustion, the way the story uses it is strategic. Storms compress time. They strip away performance. They force a person to decide what is real when everything else shakes. In that compression, the transcript introduces the idea that he wrestled privately with doubt, not necessarily doubt that God exists, but doubt that a human being can ever fully decode divine plans. That distinction matters. It allows the story to reframe his confession not as a collapse of belief, but as an evolution from certainty to humility. The confession itself, as presented, is carefully crafted. He does not apologize for decades of conviction. He does not surrender the authority of Scripture. Instead, he admits a limitation in his own interpretive reach, that some parts of God's plan remain beyond comprehension. He suggests that the relentless pursuit of absolute explanation can blind a believer to the mystery at the heart of faith, and that trust sometimes matters more than answers. In a single move, the video turns his greatest strength into the very thing that needed correction. If his certainty built the platform, then surrendering a portion of that certainty becomes a form of sacrifice. That is why the room goes silent in the transcript. Silence is not only respect. Silence is recalibration. The congregation, in this narrative, must renegotiate what they came to receive. They came for clarity, and they were offered complexity. They came for a commander, and they saw a man. The video also notes the split reaction. Some felt closer to him. Some felt unmoored. This is the emotional hinge for your script. Because the question is no longer simply, what did he admit? The question becomes, what does it do to people when their symbol of certainty asks them to carry questions? In modern religious life, many believers are exhausted by ambiguity and also suffocated by rigidity. A leader who acknowledges mystery can feel like liberation or betrayal, depending on what the listener is clinging to. The transcript positions this moment as a turning point, not necessarily because Hagee's theology suddenly flipped, but because the tone changes the relationship between leader and follower. When a preacher who once sounded like an answer key starts sounding like a fellow traveler, it reshapes the emotional contract. And once that contract shifts, legacy becomes uncertain too. The video ends this section with a forward-pulling tension. If his voice is changing, what else might change? And what does that mean for a figure whose influence has always extended beyond the sanctuary into politics, media, and public identity? By the time the service ended in the transcript's telling, the most unsettling element was not that John Hagee had changed sides or abandoned his convictions. It was that he had allowed a crack in the wall, a brief admission that the human mind cannot always turn God into a formula. The video treats this not as a throwaway line, but as a signal flare, the kind that makes people replay a sermon in their head hours later, asking themselves what they actually heard. For longtime followers, the shift lands like a paradox. They followed him because he sounded like a man who could cut through chaos, who could read Scripture with such confidence that the world's confusion felt smaller. In the story, many in the room experienced his humility as comfort because it gave them permission to be imperfect believers. If a leader known for certainty can acknowledge mystery, then maybe the ordinary person who wrestles with unanswered prayers is not failing. Maybe they're normal. That is why the transcript includes reactions like, "I've never felt so connected to him." Connection is the currency of vulnerability. It closes distance. It turns a platform into a relationship. But the video is careful to emphasize the other reaction as well, the one that rarely gets celebrated: discomfort. A certain kind of believer does not come to church to explore uncertainty. They come to escape it. They want structure, a clear map, a voice that says this is what it means, this is where we stand, this is what happens next. For them, a preacher's certainty is not arrogance, it is stability. When Hagee, the symbol, tells them that parts of God's plan are beyond comprehension, it can feel like the anchor lifting. The transcript captures that feeling in the comment, "We counted on him for clarity." In other words, the listener is not arguing theology, they are naming an emotional reliance. It is difficult to overstate how many religious movements, especially those built around broadcast ministries, are sustained by the promise of clarity in a confusing world. The video's drama comes from the risk that humility introduces. Humility is spiritually admired, but can destabilize a system built on certainty. The story then widens the lens to show how quickly a moment like this can spill beyond a sanctuary. It suggests that pastors and theologians took notice, not because Hagee is the first leader to speak about mystery, but because he is precisely the type of leader associated with strong claims and confident interpretation. In that framing, the admission becomes a case study in maturity, a move from the posture of a solver to the posture of a shepherd, from declarative certainty to a leadership style that can hold tension. The transcript even gestures toward a generational element, implying that younger Christians, who often experience faith as a journey rather than a fortress, may find this approach more resonant. That is plausible within the story's logic, because a younger audience, raised amid constant information and competing narratives, is often suspicious of absolute claims. A leader who acknowledges complexity can appear more credible to them, not less. Yet the same quality can feel like retreat to those who value unwavering stances. This is where the video's narrative becomes more strategic than it first appears. It is not only telling us what Hagee said, it is positioning his words as a bridge between two constituencies, the certainty-seeking faithful and the complexity-tolerant faithful, and then asking whether that bridge can hold the weight of his legacy. The political layer makes that question sharper. The transcript notes that Hagee's influence has long extended into public life through his advocacy and alliances, which means his tone is never purely personal. If a religious leader with political reach begins to emphasize mystery over certainty, observers may wonder whether they will soften public rhetoric, change priorities, or alter the way religious authority is exercised in civic debates. The video does not prove such outcomes, but it uses the possibility as suspense. It suggests that a shift in tone could ripple outward, and that alone is enough to keep viewers watching. For your script, this is a crucial point. You can frame the moment as less about a single sermon and more about what happens when a figure who once spoke like an answer key starts speaking like a human being. Then you return to the inner story, because without the inner story, the confession can sound like a branding pivot rather than a sincere evolution. The transcript's strongest emotional engine is the idea that storms change the way people pray and the way they speak about God. A leader can argue confidently for years, and then one private season of weakness exposes the limits of every argument. The video opens with the phrase, "personal testimony of a savage storm," and later repeats a line that feels almost like a survivor's reflex. "I just kept reading the Bible. I didn't know what else to do." That sentence, as presented, is not about a theological framework. It is about desperation. It is the language of someone who runs out of performance and falls back on habit, on Scripture as breath rather than weapon. In your narrative, you can treat that as the hinge between the public man and the private man. You build the public persona first, the controversies, the scale, the certainty, and then you let the storm strip it down. The confession becomes more believable when it is the consequence of pressure rather than an abstract idea. And once you accept that, the final question becomes unavoidable. What does this do to legacy? The transcript implies that Hagee's legacy might be reframed by the very thing some viewers would call weakness. If his earlier life was defined by bold declarations, perhaps his later chapter is defined by restraint, by acknowledging that faith is not a contest of who can sound most certain, but a relationship sustained even when certainty fails. That interpretation turns his confession into a capstone rather than an embarrassment. It suggests that after decades of being asked to represent confidence, he may be attempting something harder, to model humility without surrendering conviction. But legacy is not only what a leader intends. Legacy is what people choose to remember. Supporters may highlight this moment as proof of authenticity, evidence that he is not a performer but a believer still learning. Critics may view it as late-stage rebranding, a softening that arrives only after decades of hard-edged rhetoric. Others may dismiss it as a minor comment inflated by internet storytelling. The video does not resolve these interpretations. It leaves them in the air because unresolved tension is what drives engagement. For your part 3, the strongest close is not an accusation or a tidy moral. It is a question delivered with calm intensity. If certainty was the product he sold for decades, and now he is asking people to accept mystery, what does that ask of the listener? Does it free them because they no longer have to pretend they know everything? Or does it frighten them because they built their faith on the feeling of certainty rather than on trust? In that frame, the story stops being about John Hagee alone and becomes about a universal religious struggle, the tension between wanting God to be explainable and learning to live with the sacred unknown. In the architecture of this story, the confession is not the ending, it is the door. Once it opens, everything behind it becomes visible in a new light. The early ambition, the controversies, the private wounds, the long years of carrying an image that could never afford to tremble. The video leans into that psychological aftershock because a public figure does not change in a vacuum. If John Hagee, portrayed as a man who built his authority on certainty, is now speaking about mystery and human limitation, then the audience is invited to ask what finally forced him to say out loud what so many believers have felt silently for years. That faith can survive without complete explanations. But the sharper question is more personal. What happens inside a leader when he realizes the role he has played for decades may have required a kind of emotional dishonesty? Not dishonesty in doctrine, but in presentation. The relentless performance of certainty can become a spiritual mask. It protects the leader, satisfies the crowd, and keeps the machine running. Yet the mask slowly tightens. The transcript's tone suggests that his later life has become a negotiation between the expectations of the institution he built and the quieter, more vulnerable posture his storm produced. That negotiation is where your part 4 can dig deeper, because it is the most human conflict in the entire narrative. The story makes a careful distinction between certainty as conviction and certainty as control. Conviction is a moral stance. Control is a psychological strategy. A preacher can be deeply convicted and still admit limits. But when the public expects him to function as an oracle, the demand shifts. People do not merely want conviction. They want prediction. They want certainty that the world's chaos can be decoded. They want to believe that if they follow the right teacher, they will never feel lost. The transcript positions Hagee as someone who fed that hunger for decades, not necessarily out of manipulation, but because that was the genre of leadership he embodied. In that genre, confidence is not optional. It is the product. And when you sell confidence, you cannot easily confess fear without altering the contract. That is why the video highlights the moment as a turning point. It is not only the content of what he says, but the courage it takes to say it in a room full of people who came for certainty. The transcript also implicitly asks whether this shift is temporary or permanent. Is it a single reflective sermon in a late season of life, or is it the beginning of a broader recalibration in his message? If the video's framing is accurate, he has moved from interpreting every event through a definitive lens toward a language of humility. That is a significant repositioning for any leader with his profile. And because his profile is not limited to church, because it includes media reach and political influence, any shift becomes a story that others will interpret for their own purposes. Some will call it growth. Others will call it retreat. Still others will call it strategy. What matters for your script is to let the audience feel the tension without forcing a verdict. Uncertainty, after all, is the theme. A clean verdict would betray the premise. To deepen the emotional narrative, the most effective move is to return to the storm and treat it not as a generic hardship, but as a crucible. The transcript begins by teasing a personal crisis he debated sharing. That detail is powerful because it implies there were months of internal conflict, months of weighing what disclosure would do to his authority. Leaders at this level rarely hesitate to speak unless something is at stake. And in his case, what is at stake is identity. If people have consumed his sermons for decades as a source of certainty, then revealing vulnerability risks being interpreted as weakness. Yet silence carries its own cost. Silence can harden the leader, isolate him, and quietly drain the compassion that ministry requires. The transcript suggests his later posture includes more compassion and patience, as if the storm forced him to remember what ordinary suffering feels like. This is where you can draw a broader point that does not require speculation about specific events. Long leadership can create distance. Leaders begin to live above the ground level of pain because people protect them, praise them, and expect them to always be strong. A storm collapses that distance. It puts the leader back on the same ground as everyone else. It teaches them again the language of helplessness. The transcript's line about continuing to read the Bible because he did not know what else to do carries exactly that resonance. It is not a man speaking from a tower. It is a man speaking from the floor. Then the narrative moves outward again to the congregation's response. And this is where your part 4 can sharpen its drama. The video describes a split reaction: comfort and discomfort, connection and disorientation. That split is not a side detail. It is the heart of the story's impact. If his community has been shaped by his certainty, then a shift in his tone creates a ripple of identity crisis among the listeners. People begin to ask themselves why they believed what they believed. Did they trust God, or did they trust the feeling of certainty he provided? Did they follow a faith, or did they follow a leader? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're the questions that mature believers eventually face. The transcript suggests that for some, his admission of mystery is liberating because it reframes faith as a journey rather than a test you can fail by not knowing enough. For others, it is destabilizing because it removes the comfort of clarity. The conflict becomes not theological but emotional because it touches how people cope with fear. The video hints that this moment may echo beyond his church, reaching pastors and theologians who read it as an example of humility in leadership. That is a useful thread for your narrative because it creates scale without needing to overclaim. You can frame it as a symbolic moment. When a leader known for certainty acknowledges mystery, it gives permission for a wider culture of faith to speak more honestly. It encourages pastors to stop pretending they have answers for every pain. It encourages believers to stop feeling ashamed of questions. But at the same time, it threatens the market for certainty that has fueled large segments of modern religious media. That market thrives on definitive claims, strong conclusions, and a sense that the listener can be safe if they follow the right voice. Mystery is harder to monetize. Humility is harder to package, which raises a final tension the story quietly leaves hanging. If he truly embraces this softer posture, what happens to the machinery built around his earlier identity? Does it adapt? Does it resist? Does it fracture? The transcript does not answer, and that is precisely why it works as drama. It gives the audience an ending that feels like a beginning. In your closing for part 4, you can land on the most compelling implication of all. The confession is not simply about what he believes. It is about what kind of faith he is now willing to model publicly. A faith that is not threatened by unanswered questions. A faith that can say, with honesty, that trust sometimes matters more than explanations. And in a world addicted to certainty, that may be the most controversial message he has ever delivered. Because once a leader like John Hagee is presented as stepping away from absolute certainty, even slightly, the audience is forced to revisit everything that certainty once supported. The video frames him as a man who did not merely preach sermons, but built an ecosystem around a confident voice, a church culture, a media presence, a network of followers who trusted him to interpret Scripture and, by extension, interpret their lives. That kind of authority does not dissolve with one reflective message. It lingers, and it collides with a new tone. In that collision, the real drama is not whether he changed, but whether the people around him can accept the idea that the strongest leader in the room might also be the most honest about not knowing everything. The video's central move is psychological. It suggests that certainty can become a habit, not only for the preacher, but for the listener. When people are overwhelmed by the world, They cling to voices that speak in clean lines. Ambiguity feels like danger. Certainty feels like shelter. So if a shelter is built around a man's confident declarations, then any admission of mystery can feel like the roof shifting. This is why the transcript emphasizes the mixed reactions. Some felt closer to him because vulnerability humanizes leadership. Others felt uneasy because the relationship they had with him was not purely spiritual. It was functional. They used his clarity to manage their anxiety. They used his certainty to quiet the chaos in their own minds. And when he suggests that faith sometimes requires accepting the unknown, he is not simply offering a theological point. He is asking them to develop a different kind of courage, the kind that does not require control. That is a harder discipline than memorizing answers. It is the discipline of trust. The narrative then invites a deeper question. If certainty was the tool that brought millions to his platform, why would he risk softening it now? The transcript hints at the simplest answer: time. Decades of ministry create fatigue that no spotlight can hide. Age changes what feels important. The hunger to win debates weakens. The appetite for peace grows. But the video's framing suggests something more personal, that storms have a way of stripping leaders down to essentials. When you're shaken by something you cannot fix, your vocabulary changes. You stop speaking as if every problem can be decoded. You start speaking as if endurance matters more than explanation. In that light, the confession becomes less a strategic pivot and more a symptom of internal recalibration. The video does not need to identify the storm in detail. It only needs to imply that it was serious enough to make him debate for months whether to share it. That hesitation signals fear of exposure. And fear of exposure signals that the image of certainty had become a protective layer he was not sure he could remove without losing something important. At this point in your script, it is useful to articulate what that something important is. It is not only reputation. It is the architecture of trust that has been built around his leadership. In large ministries, trust functions like infrastructure. It keeps people engaged. It keeps giving steady. It keeps volunteers showing up. It keeps media partners aligned. It keeps influence intact. Certainty, in the story's logic, is a major load-bearing beam of that infrastructure. When Hagee, in the video's portrayal, acknowledges mystery, he is not dismantling the building, but he is changing the way the building holds weight. That can trigger tension among those who benefit from the old structure. The audience may not see those internal dynamics, but they can sense them. When a major leader becomes more reflective, the question inevitably arises: does the institution encourage that reflection, or does it quietly push him back toward the old posture because the old posture works? This is where you can deepen the drama without making unverified claims. You can frame it as a universal dynamic, how any large organization reacts when its defining voice shifts tone. Some people celebrate growth. Others fear instability. Some encourage authenticity. Others protect the brand. And in that mix, even sincere confession can become contested territory. The video also gestures toward how different groups interpret the moment. Supporters read it as maturity, an elder statesman of faith admitting that humility belongs at the heart of belief. Critics may read it as too little too late, a softer message arriving after decades of hard edges. Neutral observers may simply see it as a human moment inflated by internet storytelling. The transcript's strength is that it leaves space for all three interpretations. That is why it keeps attention. It does not force a single conclusion. It invites the viewer to decide whether this is evolution, contradiction, or rebranding. But your script can add clarity by distinguishing between message and meaning. The message is the statement about mystery and trust. The meaning depends on who is listening. For someone who has suffered, it can sound like compassion. For someone who craves certainty, it can sound like retreat. For someone outside the tradition, it can sound like a rare crack in a culture that often sells confidence too cheaply. Now, to keep the momentum, you pivot from reaction to legacy. The video repeatedly circles the idea that his influence is not only spiritual, but cultural and political. That makes his turning point larger than personal piety. It becomes a case study in how religious authority ages. Early in life, authority is often expressed as boldness and battle. Later, it can shift into restraint and reflection. The question is whether his audience will allow that aging process to be visible. Some communities do not like their heroes to grow old in public. They prefer the memory of strength, not the reality of vulnerability. Yet the transcript suggests that vulnerability might be precisely the lesson he wants to leave behind. Not a final prophecy, not a final political stance, but a reminder that faith can be sincere even when it cannot explain everything. If you want a strong ending for part 5, you land on the tension between certainty and discipleship. Certainty can attract crowds, but discipleship in the deeper sense asks people to live faithfully without guarantees. It asks them to keep going when the story is not clear. That is why the line about continuing to read the Bible because he did not know what else to do hits so hard. It is not triumphant. It is not performative. It is the posture of someone who has reached the edge of his own certainty and discovered that what remains is not an answer, but a choice to trust. And whether viewers admire him, doubt him, or disagree with him, the story insists on this final point. When a leader known for absolute confidence admits mystery, he is not only revealing something about himself. He is forcing everyone who follows him to confront what their faith has been built on all along. The video is not simply reporting a reflective sermon. It is constructing a final act portrait, the elder preacher who has spent decades projecting confidence, now standing in front of his own legacy and choosing a different posture. This matters because Hagee's influence, as the transcript frames it, was never confined to personal inspiration. His ministry has functioned like a compass for many followers. He was not only a voice that comforted, but a voice that directed, offering interpretive frames for world events, moral debates, and national identity. When a compass changes its reading, even slightly, it forces everyone holding it to reconsider where they are and why they were traveling that direction in the first place. That is why the transcript repeatedly highlights the sanctuary silence and the split reactions afterward. The silence is not only reverence. It is recognition that something in the emotional contract has shifted. The confession, as presented, is small in wording but large in implication. A leader who has been associated with absolute answers is now asking people to carry faith in the presence of unanswered questions. And the video suggests that for many, this is either the most freeing message he could deliver or the most destabilizing. The tension becomes sharper when you consider the role that certainty has played in modern religious media. Broadcast ministries often thrive on confident framing. They offer clarity as a product in an era of confusion. They reduce complexity into strong conclusions that feel actionable. This is not inherently malicious. It is a response to a hungry audience. But it creates a trap. The more people depend on your certainty, the harder it becomes to admit the limits of your knowledge. In that context, the video frames Hagee's reflection as a form of risk. He is not risking only criticism from outsiders. He is risking disappointment from insiders, from those who built their faith practice around the comfort of his decisiveness. That is the kind of risk that reveals whether vulnerability is a performance or an actual surrender. The transcript wants us to believe it is surrender, a turning from control toward trust. It depicts him as someone who has finally accepted that the mystery of God is not a problem to solve, but a reality to live with. That is a profound shift in tone, because tone often communicates more than doctrine. A leader can hold the same theological convictions and still change the emotional climate in which those convictions are delivered. This is where your narrative can become more sophisticated. Instead of arguing about whether he changed beliefs, you focus on the evolution of leadership style. The story shows a man stepping away from a posture of dominance toward a posture of humility. It suggests that after decades of declaring, he is now confessing. After decades of being the loudest voice in the room, he is willing to be the most honest. And honesty, in this case, means admitting that some answers remain out of reach. The transcript implicitly frames this as theological maturity. Many believers experience a life cycle of faith. In early stages, certainty can feel essential, a scaffold that stabilizes identity. Later, experience introduces nuance, suffering introduces complexity, and belief begins to look less like certainty and more like endurance. The video positions Hagee as entering that later stage publicly, which is rare for figures associated with strong declarations. Now, to keep the drama alive, Part 6 should lean into what the admission forces people to confront about themselves. The story's most important implication is not about Hagee's private doubts. It is about the audience's dependence. The transcript hints at this when it includes comments like, "We counted on him for clarity." That line is almost an inadvertent confession from the follower. It reveals that for some people, the leader has become a stabilizer, not only spiritually but psychologically. The leader's certainty becomes the listener's coping mechanism. If the leader steps into uncertainty, the listener is compelled to develop a more resilient faith, one that does not require a human voice to sound infallible. In that way, the video's version of the confession can be seen as an act of discipleship rather than a retreat. It pushes the congregation away from leader dependence and toward direct trust in God. But that push is uncomfortable. It threatens the ease of inherited certainty. It forces believers to stand on their own spiritual legs. The transcript also hints that this message resonates strongly with people who have lived through pain. When life becomes difficult, simplistic answers can feel insulting. Mystery, paradoxically, can feel more compassionate than certainty because it acknowledges the reality of suffering without pretending to package it neatly. That is why the line, "I just kept reading the Bible. I didn't know what else to do," functions as a climax in emotional truth. It is a sentence of survival. It suggests that his storm pushed him to the edge of what rhetoric can accomplish. And at that edge, what remains is practice, scripture, prayer, persistence. The video frames this as the moment where his public persona softened, where he stopped presenting faith as a solved equation and started presenting it as a lived relationship. Then comes the inevitable legacy question, and it should be the closing tension of Part 6. If Hagee's ministry was built on certainty, what will people remember? Will they remember the controversies and the bold stances? Will they remember the certainty as courage or as rigidity? Or will they remember the late-life humility as the truest expression of belief? The transcript suggests this moment could become his most important lesson, not because it erases what came before, but because it reframes it. It turns his lifetime of preaching into a longer narrative arc. A man begins with confidence, grows through conflict, suffers through storms, and ends by acknowledging that faith is deeper than explanation. That arc is compelling because it mirrors the journey of many believers. It invites viewers to consider that real spiritual strength may not be proven by never doubting, but by continuing to trust when certainty fades. And that is where Part 6 should leave the audience, not with a verdict on John Hagee, but with a question aimed at the viewer. If your faith has been built on certainty, what happens when certainty becomes unavailable? Do you collapse? Or do you discover that trust can hold you even in the unknown? The transcript has spent time building two versions of the same man. The public Hagee, the one who speaks in certainty, who carries prophecy like a banner, who stands firm in controversy and never appears to hesitate. And the private Hagee, the one the video claims is finally visible, an older preacher shaped by storms, softened by years, no longer interested in sounding invincible. The drama is not in whether one version is real and the other is fake. The drama is that both can be real at once. A person can be convinced and still be tired. A leader can be bold and still be wounded. A preacher can be sincere and still discover, late in life, that the deepest truths are not always the loudest. That is why the confession lands with such weight in the story's framing. It is not a scandal. It is an admission of limits. And limits are terrifying for anyone who built a life on being seen as limitless. The transcript keeps returning to one quiet idea, that faith is not always about answers. That is a dangerous sentence in a culture that rewards certainty, especially in public religion. When audiences are anxious, they do not want mystery. They want a map. They want a leader who points and says, "This is the path, and here is what happens next." And for decades, the story argues, Hagee functioned as that voice. So when he steps into reflection and asks people to accept the unknown, the question becomes sharper than theology. The question becomes relational. What do you do when the person you relied on for certainty tells you that certainty is not the highest virtue? Some listeners will hear that as liberation. Others will hear it as loss. But either way, it forces the audience to confront what they were truly seeking all along. Were they seeking God, or were they seeking control? Because certainty, if you're honest, is often a form of control. It is the belief that if you know enough, interpret enough, predict enough, you can protect yourself from disappointment. Mystery interrupts that strategy. Mystery says you cannot control the whole story. Mystery says you will have to trust even when you cannot explain. And trust is more demanding than certainty because it requires surrender. The transcript's strongest emotional line points to this surrender without needing to announce it. I just kept reading the Bible. I didn't know what else to do. That is not the voice of a man selling certainty. That is the voice of a man surviving. It is what people say when the theories stop working. It is what people do when the storm is real and the only choice is to hold on to something, not because it is proven, but because it is all they have left. In the story's logic, this is the moment the preacher becomes a person again. And once that happens, his legacy becomes complicated in the most human way. The videos suggest his influence remains undeniable. Millions have heard him. His institution is established. His advocacy has shaped conversations far beyond his church. He has been celebrated and criticized, revered and rejected. Those facts and the reaction surrounding them will not disappear because he spoke more humbly in one sermon. But Part 7's power is that it proposes a different way to measure legacy. Not by the loudest controversies or the biggest crowds, but by the final lesson a leader chooses to leave behind. If the transcript's framing is accepted, then the final lesson is not "I was right." It is "I am not God." It is "I do not hold every answer." It is "Faith is not a finished product." It is "You are allowed to be human in the presence of the divine." That message, in many ways, is more disruptive than any political statement because it undermines the market for certainty. It tells believers that maturity may look like humility rather than dominance. It tells them that spiritual strength may look like endurance rather than certainty. It tells them that doubt is not always the enemy of faith. Sometimes it is the doorway to a deeper, more honest trust. This is where you can close your script with a clean, dramatic arc. You began with a man who was known for certainty. You showed the rise, the scale, the reach, the public battles. You exposed the personal fractures and the storms. You arrived at the confession, the quieter voice, the admission that mystery is part of belief. And now, the final act is to ask what this means for the listener. Because the truth is that most people will never build a megachurch, never lead a national movement, never have their words dissected by strangers. But nearly everyone will face the same spiritual crossroads the transcript describes. The moment when the answers you thought you had stopped holding. The moment when the world becomes too complex for slogans. The moment when suffering arrives and you realize that certainty is not the same as peace. In that moment, the question becomes personal. What do you do next? Do you become bitter? Do you retreat? Do you pretend you still have answers to protect your pride? Or do you do what the story claims Hagee did? Do you keep reading? Do you keep praying? Do you keep walking even when you cannot see the whole path? That is why the transcript's ending feels like an invitation rather than a conclusion. It suggests that real faith is not proven by winning arguments or predicting events. It is proven by staying faithful when the mystery remains. And if that is the final chapter of this preacher's story, then the confession is not a collapse. It is a maturation, not the end of belief, but the end of performance. And perhaps that is what we all suspected all along. Not that he was hiding something scandalous, but that behind every voice that sounds certain, there's a human being who has had to wrestle with the unknown, just like everyone else.